Hey, I get it, you're standing in the welding aisle, looking at a wall of machines and wondering if any of them will actually help you finish that aluminum boat hull or the steel frame for your garage without blowing your budget. You've probably already read a dozen specs, watched a few YouTube demos, and maybe even asked a friend who already bought a TIG welder. The fear of spending money on something that feels great on paper but turns out to be a headache in the shop is real, especially when you're juggling a part-time gig and a weekend hobby. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. So let's break down the PATON ProTIG 200 AC/DC digital and see if it really earns a spot on your bench. This unit markets itself as a professional inverter that can handle both aluminum and steel, with a 200 amp output, a digital display, and a pulse function that promises smoother arcs. Those are all nice headlines, but the real question is, how does that translate into daily welding life? First off, who is this machine built for? If you're a small shop fabricator, a hobbyist who already knows the basics of TIG welding, or a serious DIYer who needs a machine that won't trip the house circuit when you're pulling a long run on thin aluminum, the ProTIG 200 is worth a closer look. Its 230V input means you can plug it straight into a standard European wall outlet, which is a relief compared to the 110V models that need a heavy-duty step-up transformer. The 200 amp rating gives you enough headroom to work 2 mm to 5 mm thick steel without constantly adjusting the amperage, perfect for a one-off project like a custom metal coffee table or a backyard fence repair. On the flip side, if you're a full-time professional welding on a production line that demands 300 amp continuous output or you need ultra-high duty cycles for long-duration welds, you'll probably feel the limits of this machine. The spec sheet mentions a 40% duty cycle at 200 amps, which is fine for intermittent jobs but could become a bottleneck if you're trying to run a marathon weld on something like a structural steel beam. In that scenario, you're better off looking at a larger inverter from a brand that advertises 80% or higher duty cycles at comparable amperage. Now, let's talk about the pulse function. In TIG welding, a pulse lets you modulate the current so the arc breathes in and out, which can reduce heat input on thin aluminum and give you a smoother bead on steel. The ProTIG 200 lets you adjust the pulse frequency and amplitude, which is great if you've already experimented with pulse settings on other machines. For a newcomer, however, the extra controls can be a bit overwhelming. You'll find yourself tweaking numbers while trying to keep the torch steady, and the digital display, while clear, doesn't give you any visual cues about how the pulse is affecting the weld pool. In practice, you might end up turning the pulse off entirely until you get a feel for it, then reintroducing it for the final passes where the heat control matters most. One of the most practical strengths of this welder is the contactless HF arc start. That means you don't have to touch the electrode to the workpiece to strike an arc, which reduces the risk of burning the tip and makes starting a weld on freshly cleaned aluminum much cleaner. In my own experience with older transformer-based TIGs, the sparky start could leave a little crater on the workpiece, forcing a patch-up weld. With the HF start on the ProTIG 200, you simply press the foot pedal, the arc ignites, and you're ready to lay down the bead. It's a subtle time saver, but it does add up over a day's worth of small projects. The digital interface is another point worth noting. You get a backlit LCD that shows current, voltage, and pulse settings, all selectable with a handful of buttons. This is a step up from the analog dials you see on many budget models. The downside? The menu system isn't the most intuitive. Some users have reported having to hold down a button for 3 seconds just to get to the advanced settings. If you're used to a simple knob, you'll need to spend a few minutes getting comfortable with the layout before you can dive into a serious weld. The learning curve isn't steep, but it's there. Reliability, as always, is a tricky thing to gauge without long-term data. The unit does come with a 3-year manufacturer guarantee, which is a decent safety net for a mid-range inverter. That said, the warranty doesn't cover wear and tear consumables like torch tips or gas nozzles, so you'll still need to budget for those replacement parts. I've seen similar guarantee periods on machines that lasted well beyond their warranty, and others that failed just before the coverage expired. In short, the guarantee adds peace of mind, but it's not a substitute for quality components. From a cost perspective, the PATON ProTIG 200 sits in a sweet spot between entry-level units that barely crack 150 amps and high-end models that